Bosra did not fall because its black walls were weak. The walls were still standing when the city changed hands. What failed first was confidence. Behind the gates, Byzantine officers demanded resistance, civilians counted shrinking supplies, and merchants waited for a relief army no one could prove was coming. Outside, the Muslim forces did not need to destroy the city. They only needed Bosra to understand that Constantinople might not save it. In 634, Bosra was more than a fortified city on the southern edge of Byzantine Syria. It was a military position, a commercial center, a religious city, and a gateway. Caravan routes passing through the Hauran connected Arabia with Damascus and the wider Syrian interior. Merchants moved grain, cloth, oil, livestock, metal goods, and information along those roads. Armies used many of the same routes. That mattered, because when an empire loses a road, it loses more than territory. It loses movement, supply, intelligence, tax revenue, and eventually control. Bosra had survived earlier wars because its importance made it worth defending. Its buildings were constructed largely from the dark volcanic basalt of the region. The stone gave the city its severe appearance, but the real strength of Bosra did not come from architecture alone. It came from the system around it. Imperial administration, military garrisons, local elites, Arab Christian communities tied to Byzantine authority, clergy, merchants, tax collectors, transport networks. All of them depended on one assumption: the empire would remain. Theodoros had spent most of his 46 years living inside that assumption. He was an Arab Christian merchant, born in the Hauran, accustomed to speaking Arabic in one negotiation and Greek in the next. He was not a general. That made him useful. Generals understood formations, walls, and orders. Theodoros understood what happened between them. He knew which officials delayed payments, which officers seized animals when military transport ran short, which families had enough grain hidden beneath their houses to survive a siege, which merchants publicly praised Byzantine authority while privately calculating how quickly they could adapt if that authority disappeared. He had spent 20 years watching imperial power at ground level. It was less impressive there. The ceremonies were still impressive. The titles were still impressive. The seals on official documents were still impressive. But behind them stood the same machinery that held most empires together. Taxes had to be collected. Grain had to move. Animals had to be requisitioned. Roads had to remain open. Soldiers had to be paid. Local populations had to believe resistance was safer than disobedience. When any part of that system broke, imperial language became less convincing. The first reports from the south were uncertain. Arab forces had entered Byzantine territory. Some officials called them raiders. Others described organized columns. There were arguments over numbers, arguments over commanders, arguments over whether the incursions represented a temporary frontier emergency or the beginning of something larger. The distinction mattered in Constantinople. It mattered less to a merchant standing in Bosra. Theodoros saw the first practical consequence before he understood the strategic one. Caravans stopped arriving normally. Then prices began changing. Grain rose first. Animal fodder followed. Travelers arriving from the south brought contradictory reports, but the pattern underneath them was consistent. Muslim forces were not simply crossing the frontier, taking livestock, and disappearing back into the desert. They were operating with direction. They were moving against positions. They were staying. That was the point Byzantine officials were slow to admit. Frontier governments often describe an approaching threat in the smallest possible terms until they can no longer do so. Calling an invasion a raid buys political time. It does not buy military time. Bosra began preparing. Soldiers inspected defensive positions. Gate guards increased. Movement was controlled. Local supplies were counted. Officials demanded transport animals and food stocks. The language was administrative. The effect was immediate. Families lost goods they had expected to sell. Merchants were told military necessity came first. Some complied because they supported the defense. Others complied because armed men were standing in their courtyards. There is a tendency in imperial military histories to describe requisition as logistics. For civilians, it often meant someone else deciding what they were allowed to keep. Theodoros watched two soldiers enter a neighboring storehouse and mark sacks of grain for military use. The owner protested. An officer showed him an order. That ended the argument, not because the merchant agreed, because the empire had weapons and he did not. Theodoros understood the necessity. A city preparing for siege required food. He also understood the imbalance. The military would later record quantities. It would not record the fear on the merchant's face. Then the gates began closing. The sound changed the city. Heavy mechanisms moved. Guards checked traffic. People who had delayed returning rushed toward the entrances. Others tried to leave before movement became impossible. Officers restricted them. A defended city could not allow uncontrolled movement during an enemy approach. That was sound military logic. It also meant civilians were now trapped inside the battlefield their rulers intended to defend. Theodoros stood near one of the commercial streets as families carried baskets, water containers, and whatever food they could obtain. He saw a woman arguing with a guard because relatives were still outside. The guard did not move. Orders were orders. The gate closed. The empire had protected the city by imprisoning the population inside it. That night, Theodoros went to his warehouse. His workers had stacked the remaining goods away from the entrance: oil jars, cloth, dry food, tools. Goods accumulated through years of trade suddenly looked less like merchandise and more like supplies. One of his assistants asked whether the Muslims would attack immediately. Theodoros did not answer. No one knew. What he did know was that the city's officials had begun making promises. Bosra could hold. The walls were strong. The garrison was prepared. Byzantine forces elsewhere would respond. Reinforcements would come if necessary. This was what civilians were supposed to believe. Theodoros began testing those promises against what he could see. Soldiers were confident in public. In private, officers were arguing over stores. Stable workers were being ordered to preserve military animals. Grain was being transferred. Messages were being sent north. The defensive preparations were real. So was the uncertainty. Theodoros had learned long ago that powerful governments reveal their fear through logistics before they reveal it through words. If commanders believed the danger was temporary, they would not be counting every sack. They were counting every sack. By morning, another rumor had spread. The Muslim army had moved closer. People climbed to elevated positions where they could see beyond the city. Guards forced some of them down. Military authorities did not want civilians gathering around defensive areas, but glimpses were enough. Movement on the approaches. Mounted men. Small groups establishing positions. Dust beyond the roads. Bosra was being watched. Theodoros returned to the market district. It was already changing. Some stalls had closed. Others were crowded. Families bought what they could before prices increased again. The wealthy moved quietly. That was what caught his attention. Not panic. Preparation. Men employed by several prominent households were carrying grain, oil, and dried food into private storage rooms. Those families had heard the same official promises as everyone else. They simply did not trust them enough to live by them. This was the first fracture. The city had not been attacked. No wall had been breached. No gate had been burned. But Bosra's population was already dividing into those who believed the imperial defense would work and those preparing for what would happen if it did not. Theodoros knew some of these people personally. They were not supporters of the invading army. They were not revolutionaries. Most did not want a new ruler. They wanted their families alive, their property intact, and the city spared from prolonged fighting. Empires often classify that instinct as disloyalty. Civilians call it survival. By afternoon, Byzantine officers began reinforcing the message. There would be no unauthorized negotiation. There would be no contact with the forces outside. Anyone spreading defeatism could face punishment. The order was intended to strengthen discipline. It revealed the opposite. Commanders do not threaten civilians for discussing surrender when they are certain nobody is considering it. Theodoros heard the announcement and understood what it meant. Someone already was. Later, he passed a group of local men arguing quietly near a courtyard. One insisted the city had obligations to the empire. Another answered with a question. Would the empire come if Bosra was surrounded? The first man said yes. How do you know? There was no answer. That question would soon become more dangerous than any weapon outside the walls. As evening approached, the military closed the remaining movements through the gates. Bosra was now sealed. Theodoros climbed to the roof of his warehouse. Beyond the black stone buildings, the southern horizon was broken by small points of light. Campfires, not one, many. The enemy had arrived close enough to be seen at night. Behind Theodoros, church bells and human voices carried across the city. Ahead of him, the fires remained fixed. The Muslim forces were not passing through. They were waiting. The Byzantine officers had told Bosra that its walls would protect it. But walls only solve one problem. They keep an enemy outside. They cannot create food. They cannot manufacture reinforcements. They cannot force civilians to believe promises forever. And they cannot stop a city from breaking into factions. Theodoros looked toward the fires and then back toward the streets below. The siege had not yet reached its most violent stage. No major assault had begun. No decisive engagement had been fought. Yet the first battle was already underway. Not outside the walls, inside them. A military faction was preparing to resist. A civilian faction was beginning to calculate the price of that resistance. And somewhere between those two groups stood men like Theodoros, people who would soon be forced to decide whether loyalty to an empire was worth the destruction of their own city. The black walls of Bosra were still intact. Confidence behind them was not. And that was the weakness the coming campaign would expose. If you're listening from a city, country, or community whose history has been shaped by conquest, resistance, or the rise and fall of empires, comment your location below. Tell us where this forgotten history is being heard today. By the second day of isolation, Bosra had stopped behaving like one city. The walls still enclosed everyone together. The gates were still under Byzantine control. The same bells marked the hours. The same streets carried soldiers, clergy, merchants, servants, laborers, and families, trying to understand what would happen next. But politically, Bosra had already divided. One faction wanted resistance, the other wanted terms. The first group had the weapons, the second group had the food, property, commercial networks, and families that would absorb the consequences if the defense failed. That imbalance shaped everything. The Byzantine military command framed the issue as loyalty. To resist was loyalty. To question the defense was weakness. To discuss negotiation was treason. This was convenient for the officers because it transformed a strategic argument into a moral one. Once that happened, they no longer had to answer the hardest question: how long could Bosra actually hold? Instead, they asked who was willing to prove obedience. The pressure began with requisitions. More grain was taken from private stores. Pack animals were assigned to military use. Blacksmiths were ordered to prioritize weapons, fittings, and repairs. Laborers were redirected toward defensive work. Families with carts lost them to transport duty. Again, all of this made military sense. A besieged city required organization. But imperial records usually preserve only the administrative side of these measures. Numbers, inventories, orders. They rarely preserve who lost winter stores, whose animals were taken, whose household labor disappeared into military service, or who was expected to survive afterward. Theodoros saw the consequences directly. One of his trading partners, a man named Elias, arrived at his warehouse just after sunrise. He was angry but speaking quietly. 2 of his best mules had been taken, not purchased, taken. He had been told they were needed for the defense. Without them, he could not move his remaining goods even if the roads reopened. They say they will return them. Theodoros looked at him. Neither man believed that. The animals might survive. They might not. The promise cost the officers nothing. That was the pattern. The garrison demanded sacrifice now and promised compensation later. The civilians were expected to trust that there would be a later. Theodoros had heard that kind of language before. Governments under pressure always borrowed against the future. The problem was that civilians usually carried the debt. At the same time, the hardline faction inside Bosra was growing more aggressive. Its strongest supporters included officers, military households, administrators, and men whose status depended directly on Byzantine authority. For them, Surrender was not merely a military decision. It threatened their position. If the city negotiated too early, then those who had built their influence through the imperial system could lose more than a battle. They could lose the system itself. This was one of the realities later histories often simplified. A city's defenders did not all resist for the same reason. Some believed in imperial duty. Some feared punishment. Some expected relief. Some understood that defeat would destroy their careers. Some were protecting the city. Others were protecting their place within it. These motives overlapped. They were not identical. The second faction was more difficult to define. It had no commander, no banner, no formal council. It consisted of merchants, clergy, landowners, craftsmen, Arab Christian families, and men who had spent years operating between imperial authority and local society. They did not necessarily support the Muslim army outside. Many feared it. Some had relatives serving under Byzantine command. Some had traded with imperial officials for decades, but they had begun asking a different question. Not whether resistance was honorable, whether resistance was survivable. That question moved through houses and courtyards in low voices. Theodoros heard it everywhere. How much grain remained? How much water could be controlled? How long before prices doubled again? What happened if another engagement failed? Would the Muslims accept surrender? Would the garrison permit it? Would relief arrive first? No one had reliable answers. That uncertainty made the city more dangerous. Fear does not automatically produce surrender. Sometimes it produces harsher control. Byzantine patrols began paying closer attention to gatherings. Men speaking near gates were questioned. Travel between neighborhoods was watched. Rumors became military threats. A sentence repeated in the wrong place could bring a guard to your door. Theodoros understood why. A besieged command could not permit panic. But there was a line between controlling panic and criminalizing doubt. Bosra was moving toward that line quickly. One afternoon, a confrontation broke out near a grain depot. It was not a battle. It was smaller. That made it more revealing. A military quartermaster had ordered additional sacks moved into controlled storage. A group of residents objected. They wanted part of the grain left for neighborhood distribution. The argument escalated. A soldier shoved one man backward. Another civilian stepped forward. Hands went to weapons. For several seconds, the city came closer to internal bloodshed than to an enemy assault. An officer arrived before anyone drew a blade. He ordered the civilians away. One protested. "If the army eats, what do our children eat?" The officer answered without hesitation. "If the army fails, none of you eat." The logic was brutal. It was also incomplete. The civilians understood something the officers refused to say aloud. If the army failed after consuming the city's reserves, then Bosra would lose both the defense and the food. That was the calculation spreading through the population. Theodoros did not witness the confrontation from a distance. He was there when it ended. He watched the civilians leave. No one shouted. No one attacked the soldiers. They simply walked away. That silence was more serious than anger. People who still believe in a system argue with it. People who have stopped believing begin making other plans. That evening, Theodoros was summoned to a private house near the commercial quarter. The invitation came through a deacon he knew. No explanation. Just a request to come alone. He considered refusing. Then he went. Inside, 8 men were waiting. 2 merchants, a priest, a property owner, a former municipal official, 3 men from prominent Arab Christian families. No soldiers, no weapons displayed. The room was quiet. The oldest man spoke first. "We need to know whether the army outside will negotiate." Theodoros did not answer immediately. That was not a casual question. Contact with the besieging forces could be treated as collaboration. If the military command discovered the meeting, every man in the room could be detained, possibly worse. Theodoros looked at them one by one. "You are asking the wrong man," the priest replied. "No. We are asking the man who can speak to both sides." That was when Theodoros understood why he had been brought there. His languages, his trade connections, his reputation for dealing across boundaries. All the skills that had made him useful in peace now made him dangerous in war. He stood. If you want surrender, tell the commander. One of the merchants laughed once. There was no humor in it. You think he will listen? Theodoros said nothing. They already knew the answer. The hardline faction controlled the garrison. Any formal proposal for negotiation could be crushed before it was considered. The priest leaned forward. We are not asking to open the gates. Not yet. The phrase remained unspoken. They wanted information. What terms might be offered? Would property be protected? Would churches remain? Would inhabitants be allowed to stay? Would tribute be demanded? Would soldiers be permitted to withdraw? These were not abstract questions. They were questions asked by people already imagining defeat. Theodoros refused again. He told them that unauthorized contact could destroy the city faster than the siege. If the garrison suspected betrayal, it could turn inward. Arrests, confiscations, violence between factions. A city under pressure did not need much to fracture. Then the former official said something that changed the room. The officers are preparing another operation. Theodoros turned toward him. What operation? A sortie. That mattered. Defensive walls had kept Bosra secure so far. A sortie meant troops leaving that protection to engage the enemy outside. It could work. A successful attack might disrupt the Muslim positions, raise morale, and prove that the defenders still controlled the initiative. It could also fail, and if it failed, Bosra would lose trained men it could not replace. Theodoros asked how soon. Soon. No one knew more. The meeting ended without agreement. But something had changed. The negotiation faction had moved beyond private complaint. They were organizing. Not openly. Not yet. But enough people now believed the military command might sacrifice the city to preserve imperial honor. And enough people were beginning to ask whether saving Bosra required disobeying those who claimed to defend it. Theodoros returned home after dark. On the way, he passed a military patrol. One of the soldiers recognized him. Out late. Theodoros answered that he had been discussing grain. It was not entirely false. The soldier stared at him for a moment, then moved on. Theodoros continued walking. Behind him, he could hear boots against stone. Ahead, the streets were almost empty. He now understood the real danger. The enemy outside Bosra had not yet broken the defenses, but inside the city, two competing definitions of survival were forming. The military believed survival meant holding the walls until imperial relief arrived. The civilians increasingly believed survival meant ending the siege before the city was consumed by it. Both sides still claimed to be saving Bosra. Soon they would begin treating each other as the greater threat. The relief army became more important each day because no one could see it. That was the contradiction at the center of Bosra's defense. The city was being told to hold for forces that existed mainly in promises. Military commands can survive for a time on confidence alone. A garrison does not need to see reinforcements immediately. It only needs to believe that someone is coming. Once that belief begins to fail, the entire defensive calculation changes. Theodoros understood this before many of the soldiers did, not because he had access to imperial strategy, because merchants live by movement. They notice when roads go quiet. They notice when animals stop arriving from one direction. They notice when men who normally carry news from Damascus suddenly have nothing to report. They notice absence. And by now, the absence was becoming impossible to ignore. No major supply column had reached Bosra. No body of troops had appeared on the northern approaches. No caravan master had seen an army moving south in numbers large enough to break the siege. The city was still being told that help was coming. The roads were saying otherwise. Theodoros began asking questions carefully, not in meetings, not in writing, in movement. He went where information passed naturally. A stable near the administrative quarter, a workshop repairing military tack, a grain yard where government animals had once been counted before dispatch. He did not ask whether reinforcements were coming. That would attract attention. He asked which roads were still open, which horses had arrived exhausted, which messengers had changed mounts, which military animals were being kept ready. The answers formed a pattern. Messages were going north. Responses were not returning with armies behind them. The distinction mattered. A plea for help is not a relief force. A sealed message is not a column of infantry. A promise from an officer is not evidence. Bosra was defending itself on language. Theodoros encountered the first direct sign of military anxiety near the northern gate. A messenger had arrived after dark. His horse was sweating heavily, its flanks marked by hard riding. The rider was taken inside immediately. No public announcement followed. That was unusual. If the news had been good, the command would have used it. Besieged governments do not hide victories. They display them. They announce approaching allies. They exaggerate numbers. They turn every favorable report into a weapon against fear. Instead, the officers said nothing. The next morning, patrols increased. Additional men were placed along the walls. A stock of arrows was moved toward the western sector. The sortie preparations continued. That told Theodoros enough. The message had not brought rescue. It had brought pressure. What Bosra faced was larger than a single siege. Byzantine Syria was being forced to respond across multiple points. The Muslim forces moving into the region did not need to defeat every imperial formation at once. They needed to create enough uncertainty that local commanders could no longer know where reinforcements should go first. That was the strategic problem. An empire may possess more soldiers overall and still fail to save one city in time. Distance consumes strength. Orders consume time. Confusion does the rest. Theodoros saw the result at street level. A military clerk who usually treated him with contempt suddenly asked whether his trading contacts knew anything about movement toward Damascus. The question was revealing. Imperial officials were now seeking intelligence from the commercial networks they had spent days controlling. Theodoros answered carefully. Nothing reliable. The clerk lowered his voice. Nothing at all. Nothing large. The man looked away. That was enough. For the first time, someone connected to the administration had shown him fear without meaning to. Theodoros did not report this to the men who wanted negotiation. He no longer trusted anyone enough for that. The city was becoming a place where information itself carried danger. One faction used uncertainty to argue for surrender. The other used uncertainty to justify tighter discipline. A careless sentence could be taken as evidence of conspiracy. An accurate observation could be treated as defeatism. This is how military pressure changes civilian life before a single wall falls. Truth becomes subordinate to morale. What people are allowed to say is determined by what the command needs soldiers to believe. The harder Bosra's officers insisted that relief was coming, the more suspicious Theodoros became. Then the consequences reached his own household. His younger cousin, Stephanos, had been assigned to transport duty with the garrison. He was not a professional soldier. He had experience with animals and carts. That was enough. Military systems under strain stop caring about occupational boundaries. If a man can lead a mule, he becomes transport personnel. If he can lift stone, he becomes labor. If he owns grain, he becomes supply. If he owns a cart, the cart becomes imperial property in practice, whether or not the paperwork says otherwise. Stephanos returned briefly after 2 days away. He was exhausted, not wounded, not frightened enough to panic, just tired in the specific way of a civilian being absorbed into military work he had never chosen. Theodoros gave him water. What are they moving? Food, arrows, equipment. Where? Toward the walls. Why? Stephanos hesitated, then answered. They think the Muslims are shifting men. Where? Everywhere. That was the problem. No one inside Bosra had a clear picture of the force outside. Every movement could be preparation for assault. Every cloud of dust became a possible column. Every mounted patrol could be reconnaissance or the beginning of something larger. The garrison could not know, so it prepared for several possibilities at once. That consumed men. It consumed sleep. It consumed supplies, and it increased the pressure to act. Waiting favors the side that believes time is working for it. Bosra's command was starting to believe the opposite. The promised relief had still not appeared. By now, some soldiers were talking about it openly, not in front of officers, at wells, near stable walls, while carrying equipment. Theodoros heard one man say that Damascus would not abandon Bosra. Another asked when Damascus had last sent anything useful. The first man told him to shut his mouth. That exchange mattered more than it seemed. Doubt had crossed from civilians into the garrison. Once soldiers begin asking whether the command's promises are true, discipline becomes more expensive to maintain. The officers responded in the predictable way. They increased certainty in their public language. Relief was coming. The enemy could not remain indefinitely. Bosra's position was strong. Any suggestion otherwise helped the besiegers. This was not simply propaganda. Some officers probably believed it. That makes these moments more dangerous, not less. Military disasters are not always caused by men who know they are lying. They are often caused by men who mistake institutional confidence for evidence. Theodoros finally approached an older acquaintance named Marcellus, a minor administrative functionary who had spent years handling transport records. He found him outside a storage building after dusk. There were no documents between them, no secret letter, no dramatic proof. Theodoros asked one question. "How many troops are coming?" Marcellus stared at him. Theodoros waited. "Do not ask me that." "Then tell me when." No answer. Theodoros stepped closer. "When?" Marcellus looked toward the street before speaking. "We asked." That was all. Theodoros understood immediately. "You asked for troops?" "Yes. And?" "We were told the situation is being assessed." There it was. Not rescue. Assessment. Not deployment. Consideration. Theodoros felt something colder than fear. He felt confirmation. The city had been ordered to hold around a possibility. "Do the officers know?" Marcellus looked at him sharply. "Of course they know." That was worse. It meant the men demanding continued resistance were not simply uninformed. At least some of them understood that no relief column had yet been secured. Yet they were still presenting assistance as if it were inevitable. Theodoros did not accuse Marcellus. There was no point. The official looked tired enough already. "Why are they saying an army is coming?" Marcellus gave him the answer every empire eventually gives. "Because if they stop saying it, the city may stop holding." That sentence explained more than any order could have. The promise of reinforcement was no longer a report. It was part of the defense. Theodoros returned through streets where residents were now paying more for basic food, and soldiers were sleeping closer to their posts. He understood the military logic. If civilians believed they were abandoned, negotiations might begin. If soldiers believed they were abandoned, the walls might still stand, but the garrison could break. So the command maintained the promise. What mattered was not whether relief existed. What mattered was whether Bosra continued behaving as though it did. This is the point imperial histories often blur. They describe cities as holding bravely. They describe commanders maintaining discipline. They describe populations enduring siege. They do not always ask what those populations were told in order to make them endure. They do not ask whether civilians were given an honest choice between resistance and negotiation. They rarely calculate who paid for the time commanders were trying to buy. Bosra was paying. The price was visible now. More households were cutting meals. More animals were disappearing into military use. More men were sleeping near defensive positions. More civilians were whispering about terms. The promised relief army had still not appeared. Instead, the garrison accelerated preparations for the sortie. Theodoros realized why. If help could not be brought quickly to Bosra, the defenders would have to create their own proof of strength. They needed a battlefield success. Something visible, something immediate. Something powerful enough to silence the men asking whether the empire had abandoned them. A victory outside the walls could restore confidence. A defeat could destroy what remained of it. By dawn, soldiers were assembling near one of the gates. Equipment was checked. Horses were brought forward. Officers moved through the formation. Theodoros watched from a side street as Stephanos helped lead animals toward the staging area. This was no longer preparation for passive defense. Bosra was about to gamble. The black walls had protected the city. Now the garrison was preparing to leave them. Not because the walls had failed, because the promise behind them had. The gate opened before sunrise. The first men through were cavalry. Behind them came infantry in tighter formation, then officers trying to keep the movement controlled as the column cleared the walls. For several days, Bosra had forced the enemy to operate outside its defenses. Now the defenders reversed that advantage themselves. This was the gamble. A sortie can work when it is fast, concentrated, and tied to a specific objective. Strike one exposed position, break a siege line, burn equipment, disrupt supply, withdraw before the enemy can reorganize. But Bosra's defenders needed more than a tactical success. They needed a political one. The entire city was watching. If the garrison returned victorious, the negotiation faction could be silenced. If it returned in disorder, the argument over surrender would no longer be theoretical. Theodoros stood near the approach to the gate as the last units moved out. He could not see the battlefield clearly from there. He could see the faces. Some soldiers looked disciplined. Others looked tired. Several had been pulled from duties that had already kept them awake through the night. Stephanos was among the transport men moving animals behind the formation. Theodoros caught his arm for a moment. "Stay behind the line." Stephanos gave him a short look. "That is where they put us." Then he moved on. Theodoros watched him disappear through the gate. The doors closed again. For the first time since the siege began, part of Bosra's defense was outside the walls and beyond the direct protection of the city. The streets behind the gate filled slowly with civilians, not close enough to interfere, close enough to listen. At first there was almost nothing, then distant movement, shouting, the irregular sound of cavalry, a signal horn, then another. People tried to interpret every sound. That is what civilians do when commanders deny them information. They build conclusions from noise. A woman asked whether the army was advancing. No one knew. A merchant said the Muslims were withdrawing. He had no evidence. Someone else claimed more Byzantine troops had appeared from the north. That was false. But for several minutes people believed it because they needed to. Then the first wounded man came back. He was walking. That was important. A retreat does not always begin with men running. Sometimes it begins with one soldier returning under escort, then two, then a horse without a rider, then men carrying someone between them. The gate opened only long enough to admit them. The civilians watching became quieter. Another group returned. One soldier had lost his shield. Another was holding his arm against his body. No one announced what had happened. No officer stepped forward to describe a victory. That silence told the city more than a proclamation would have. Outside, the Byzantine force had encountered resistance stronger than the command had expected. The Muslim formations did not dissolve under pressure. They absorbed the attack. Then they countered. The exact sequence mattered less to Bosra than the result. The defenders failed to create the clean battlefield success they needed. Instead of breaking the siege, they exposed the limits of their own offensive strength. That is the danger of a sortie launched partly for morale. Military action becomes hostage to political expectations. A tactical withdrawal can be survivable. A public failure in front of a doubtful population can be far more damaging. By late morning, the withdrawal became obvious. The gates opened wider. Orders were shouted from inside the walls. Men were sent forward to clear the entry route. The first organized groups came back quickly. Then the formation loosened. Then the wounded arrived in greater numbers. Theodoros saw one officer trying to force men away from the entrance so returning troops would not become trapped. The command was correct. A congested gate could turn retreat into disaster. But order was becoming difficult. Soldiers wanted inside. Civilians wanted information. Transport men were trying to recover animals. Officers were shouting conflicting instructions. The walls had become both sanctuary and bottleneck. Theodoros moved closer. He searched for Stephanos. Nothing. More men entered. Still nothing. Then a mule came through without its handler. Theodoros recognized the harness. He pushed forward. A guard blocked him. "Back." "My cousin is outside." "Back." Theodoros tried again. The guard put a hand against his chest. There was no discussion after that. Military systems protect access before they protect individual grief. Theodoros stepped away. He waited. The city waited with him. Eventually Stephanos appeared. He was helping another man walk. His clothing was dirty. His face was grey with exhaustion. But he was alive. Theodoros reached him only after both men had crossed fully inside. "What happened?" Stephanos looked back toward the gate. "They did not break." That was all he said at first. Theodoros did not need more. The garrison had gone out expecting to impose pressure. Instead, it had discovered that the army outside was prepared to stand. The psychological effect moved through Bosra within hours. The hardliners tried to control it immediately. The sortie was described as limited. The troops had returned in order. The enemy had suffered losses. The city remained secure. All of those statements could be true in some form. None addressed the real issue. The sortie had failed to change the strategic situation. The Muslim forces were still outside. The relief army was still absent. Bosra had spent men, animals, ammunition, and confidence. The siege remained. That was the result civilians understood. By afternoon, the negotiation faction grew bolder. Not publicly. Publicly, the city still belonged to the garrison. Privately, the question had changed. Before the sortie, people asked whether Bosra could hold. After the sortie, they asked what the command intended to achieve by continuing. That was far more dangerous. Once civilians stop asking whether resistance is possible and begin asking what resistance is for, military authority has already lost part of the argument. The officers knew it. Their response was harsher control. A merchant was detained after repeating that the army outside had not been pushed back. Another man was struck by soldiers after saying that the promised relief force did not exist. Gatherings near the market were dispersed. Watch patrols increased again. The defense was turning inward. This is another fact often buried beneath campaign narratives. When an imperial garrison fears defeat, civilians can become part of the security problem. Not because they are armed, because they are witnesses. They see failed attacks. They see wounded soldiers. They see empty roads. They hear promises that no longer match events. An army can fight an enemy outside the walls. It cannot easily fight what the population has already seen. Theodoros encountered the hardest version of that conflict that evening. A man named Damianos, a local merchant known for supporting continued resistance, was standing in front of a small crowd near a storage courtyard. His brother served with the garrison. His family had worked with imperial officials for years. He had mocked the negotiation faction only days earlier. Now his voice was lower. "My brother says there was no breakthrough." One of the men beside him answered, "Then why are they telling us there was?" Damianos did not reply. That silence mattered. Another supporter had crossed from certainty into doubt. Not because Theodoros had convinced him, not because of secret information, because the battle itself had forced the issue. This was the new stage of Bosra's collapse. Reality was beginning to recruit its own witnesses. The military command could still arrest people. It could still control the gates. It could still command armed men. But it could not reverse what had happened outside the walls. The garrison had taken the offensive. The offensive had failed to break the siege, and every soldier who came back through the gate carried that fact with him. That night, Theodoros was summoned again, not to the same house. That would have been reckless. This meeting took place inside a workshop after the workers had left. Only 5 men were present. The priest was there. So was the former municipal official. The others were new. One of them was connected to a family with influence near a secondary gate. That detail did not seem important at first. Theodoros assumed they wanted him to discuss possible negotiations again. They did not. The priest spoke first. "We cannot wait for the command to change its mind." Theodoros understood the direction immediately. "No. You have not heard what we are asking." "I know enough." The former official stepped forward. "If there is another sortie, or if they decide to resist an assault inside the outer districts, we lose control of this. You never had control. That is the point." Theodoros looked at the new man. He had said nothing. Then the man finally spoke. "There is a gate. They are not watching closely from outside." Theodoros did not move. The sentence was quiet. Its meaning was not. The Muslims were concentrating attention where resistance was expected. The Byzantine command was doing the same. Both armies were looking toward the obvious points of attack. The men in the workshop were thinking about a gate almost no one considered decisive, a gate that might end the siege without being stormed. Theodoros felt the argument change completely. Negotiation was one thing, secret contact was worse. Opening a gate crossed another line entirely. That could end the siege. It could also trigger fighting inside the city before anyone had agreed to terms. "You are talking about letting soldiers in." "No," the priest said. "We are talking about preventing this city from being destroyed." Theodoros stared at him. Those were not the same thing. Not yet. But they were getting closer. The meeting ended without agreement. Theodoros walked back through streets still carrying the smell of animals, sweat, dust, and hurried military movement from the failed sortie. Behind him, the garrison was reinforcing the obvious defenses. Ahead, somewhere inside the city, a different plan had begun. Bosra's most dangerous gate was no longer the one the enemy was attacking. It was the one people inside were beginning to consider opening themselves. The gate was not weak. That was why it mattered. Bosra's commanders expected danger where the Muslim forces were visible. Men were concentrated near the approaches most likely to face an assault. Patrols watched the obvious roads. Archers were rotated through exposed sectors. Officers inspected the sections where ladders, rams, or a direct rush might be attempted. The secondary gate received attention because regulations required it, not because anyone believed it would decide the siege. That difference created an opportunity. The men who had spoken to Theodoros understood it before he did. They were not planning to overpower the guards. They were not soldiers. They did not have enough men. A violent seizure of the gate would almost certainly fail, and would give the Byzantine command justification to arrest anyone associated with negotiation. Their plan depended on something quieter. Control the men assigned there. Create a short period when movement near the gate would not immediately attract suspicion. Establish contact outside. Secure terms before anyone entered. Then force the military command to confront a situation it could no longer reverse without risking fighting inside Bosra itself. It was dangerous because every stage depended on discipline. Civilian conspiracies rarely possess much of it. Theodoros knew that. He had spent years negotiating with merchants who could not keep a price secret for half a day. Now those same social networks were being asked to conceal an action that could be punished as treason. He wanted no part of it. For 2 days he avoided the men connected to the gate. He returned to his warehouse. He checked remaining stores. He spoke with Stephanos. He watched the garrison repair equipment damaged during the failed sortie. He tried to act as if the decision belonged to someone else. It did not. The city continued moving toward him. Military losses from the sortie had to be absorbed. Men who had been held in reserve were reassigned. Civilian labor increased. Storage buildings closer to the defensive sectors were cleared. Then the command made a decision that changed Theodoros's position. Military stores were moved into structures bordering a densely inhabited quarter, not because commanders wanted civilians endangered, because they wanted ammunition and equipment closer to the walls. From a purely military perspective, the logic was efficient. Reduce transport time, shorten the distance between stockpiles and defenders, keep replacement material within immediate reach. But the buildings around those stores were not empty. Families lived there. Workshops operated there. Children slept there. The command had placed the needs of the defense inside civilian space and expected the population to accept the risk. That afternoon, Theodoros watched carts unloading bundles of arrows, shields, spare weapons, and containers of material intended for military use. A woman stood in the doorway of a nearby house. She asked an officer whether the stores could be placed somewhere else. He told her no. She asked what would happen if the fighting reached the street. The officer told her to remain inside. It was a small exchange. No violence, no arrest, no speech. It revealed the entire structure. The military decided where danger would be placed. Civilians were instructed to live around it. Later, histories would call this preparation. The families living beside those preparations had another word for it: exposure. Theodoros found the priest before sunset. "I will make contact." The priest did not celebrate. That would have been foolish. "When?" "Not until I know what they are asking for. They want terms. That is not enough." Theodoros began setting conditions. No gate would be opened before guarantees were discussed. No armed group inside Bosra would move against the garrison. No Muslim troops would approach the secondary gate in numbers large enough to alarm the guards. No one would promise what they could not control. The priest listened. Then he asked the obvious question. And if they refuse? Then the gate stays shut. That was Theodoros's position. He still believed negotiation could be separated from surrender. He was about to discover how little control any intermediary actually possesses once armies are involved. The first contact was not made at the gate. That would have been too obvious. A laborer who had previously worked caravan routes was selected to carry a signal from a section of ground where patrols sometimes approached the outer defenses. His task was simple: no letters, no seal, no document that could be seized. A spoken message. There were people inside Bosra prepared to discuss terms. Send someone authorized to answer. The laborer, left under cover of an ordinary disposal detail, allowed close enough to the outer zone to avoid immediate suspicion. He did not walk directly toward the Muslim lines. He waited, changed direction, stopped, then continued. From the wall, nobody watching casually would have seen more than a civilian moving badly under pressure. Theodoros watched from farther back. The man disappeared from view. Hours passed. He returned after dark. No one stopped him. Inside the workshop used for the meeting, he repeated what he had been told. The Muslim side would hear proposals. They expected submission. They would not wait indefinitely. That changed the mood immediately. Some of the men wanted to proceed. Others accused the messenger of misunderstanding. One merchant demanded to know whether homes would be protected. Another asked about churches. Another asked whether Byzantine soldiers would be allowed to leave. The laborer had no answers. He had not been sent to negotiate a treaty, only to determine whether negotiation was possible. The room became louder. Theodoros stopped them. "This is why the gate remains closed." They looked at him. "We know nothing yet." That was true. But the threshold had been crossed. The city now had an unauthorized channel to the army outside. If Byzantine command discovered it, the argument over negotiation would end in arrests. Theodoros's role also changed. Until that night he had been a merchant drawn into politics. Now he was participating in contact with the besieging force. Whatever his intentions, imperial law would not care about the distinction. He understood that clearly. The next problem was access. Someone had to meet an authorized representative outside the walls. Theodoros could not simply walk through a gate controlled by soldiers. The conspirators needed a gap. They found it in routine. Every defensive system develops routines because men cannot remain at maximum alert forever. Guard changes, food delivery, water distribution, inspection rounds, animal movement, waste removal. Routine creates predictability. Predictability creates weakness. The secondary gate had one particular period late at night when the senior officer responsible for the sector normally moved to inspect a nearby wall position. For a short interval, authority passed to a junior guard commander. That man had relatives among the civilian faction. He had not agreed to open the gate, but he had agreed not to see everything. This is how cities sometimes change hands, not through a single dramatic betrayal, through layers of limited consent. One man does not ask a question, another leaves a corridor unguarded for several minutes, another delays reporting unusual movement. Each tells himself he has not surrendered anything. Together they create an opening large enough to change history. Theodoros hated the arrangement, not because it was ineffective, because it was impossible to control once begun. The first external meeting took place beyond a narrow service passage after midnight. Theodoros went with one other man, no weapons, no visible insignia. The gate was not fully opened. A smaller access point was used. The junior guard commander turned away. That was his contribution. Theodoros stepped outside Bosra. For the first time since the siege began, the walls were behind him. The distance between the city and the Muslim positions felt larger on foot than it had from the rooftops. He and his companion stopped at a prearranged point. Two mounted men approached first. They checked them. Then another man came forward. The conversation was brief. Theodoros spoke Arabic. "We are here to discuss whether the city can surrender without destruction." The answer was immediate. "Then speak for the city." "I do not." The man looked at him. "Then why are you here?" "Because the men who speak for the city will not negotiate." That was the real crisis. Bosra had reached the point where civilians were seeking terms their own military command refused to consider. Theodoros asked about protection, property, religious buildings, the lives of inhabitants, the possibility of ending resistance through agreed submission rather than assault. The Muslim representative did not offer unlimited promises. He did not need to. The balance was shifting toward his side. Terms could be discussed, but Bosra would have to stop resisting. There would be obligations, submission would be recognized. The city could preserve much by yielding before it was taken by force. The message was calculated, not generous, not theatrical, military. The choice was being reduced. Theodoros returned before dawn. Inside, the faction divided again. One group argued that the terms were sufficient to force a settlement. Another insisted they needed stronger guarantees. A third group panicked. They had supported negotiation when it was theoretical. Now that contact existed, they understood what discovery would mean. One man wanted the entire operation stopped. Another wanted the gate opened immediately before the command could react. Theodoros refused both extremes. "We do nothing tonight." The priest stared at him. "We may not have another night." Theodoros knew that was what made the decision dangerous. Outside, the Muslim army still controlled the pressure. Inside, Byzantine officers still controlled the weapons. Between them stood civilians trying to prevent both sides from turning Bosra into a battlefield. History often reduces such people to collaborators or anonymous inhabitants. That is easier than admitting what siege warfare actually does. It forces civilians to choose between authorities armed with different forms of power. One demands continued resistance. The other demands submission. Neither gives ordinary people complete control over the consequences. Before dawn, Theodoros approached the secondary gate again. He intended only to confirm that the access route remained secure. He found the junior guard commander waiting. His face was tense. Theodoros looked at the locking mechanism. Something was wrong. One of the heavy securing pins had already been withdrawn. Theodoros turned. "Who did this?" The guard did not answer. Someone inside Bosra had stopped waiting for negotiations to finish. The plan had moved beyond Theodoros, and the gate that was supposed to prevent destruction was now one mistake away from bringing an army into the city. The missing pin changed everything. Until that moment, Theodoros had believed the civilian faction still controlled the pace. They did not. Someone inside Bosra had decided that negotiation was taking too long. The secondary gate was no longer a contingency. It was becoming an active breach. Theodoros seized the junior guard commander by the arm. "Put it back." The man hesitated. "Now." Together, they forced the heavy securing pin into place. It was not enough. Theodoros immediately understood the larger problem. Whoever had removed it knew the gate could be opened. That person could try again. And next time, there might be armed men waiting on the other side. Theodoros left the gate and went directly to the priest. He found 3 others already there. Their faces confirmed what he feared. The faction had split again. One group wanted negotiated surrender. Another believed the military command would never accept it and wanted to create an irreversible situation. Open the gate. Admit a small Muslim force. Force the garrison to choose between surrender and street fighting. The plan was reckless. It assumed armed men entering a city would remain exactly where civilians wanted them. It assumed Byzantine soldiers would hesitate. It assumed panic could be controlled. None of those assumptions were safe. Theodoros said so. If fighting begins inside the walls, we lose the only advantage we still have. The priest asked what advantage remained. The city is still intact. That was the point. Bosra had not been stormed. Its streets had not become a battlefield. Its warehouses still held goods. Its churches still stood. Its civilian quarters had not been subjected to the uncontrolled violence that often followed a contested breach. That condition had value. Theodoros intended to use it. He demanded one final negotiation. Not another vague exchange, not another promise. Terms. If the Muslim commanders wanted Bosra without a destructive assault, they would have to make clear what submission meant. The conspirators agreed because the alternative was already approaching. A rumor had reached them that Byzantine officers were preparing another operation, possibly another sortie, possibly a stronger defense of the outer approaches. No one knew. But the garrison was moving men again. Time was closing. Theodoros left through the same controlled access after midnight. This time the meeting outside was different. The Muslim representative was not alone. Several armed men stood behind him, not enough to assault the gate, enough to demonstrate that the army understood what was happening inside Bosra. Theodoros spoke quickly. "The city can be delivered without a fight inside the walls." The representative answered. "Then why is it not delivered?" "Because the garrison has not agreed. That is your problem." Theodoros did not argue. From the besieging army's perspective, it was true. The political division inside Bosra was not their responsibility. They had created pressure. Now they could wait for that pressure to work. Theodoros asked the questions one last time. Would inhabitants who stopped resisting be protected? Would property remain with its owners under agreed terms? Would religious communities be left in place? Would there be organized submission rather than an uncontrolled entry? The answer was conditional. If Bosra surrendered before further resistance forced an assault, terms could be given. There would be tribute. Authority would change. Armed resistance would end. The city would not dictate the political outcome, but it could still influence the manner of defeat. That was enough, not because the terms were generous, because the alternative was becoming worse. Theodoros returned before dawn. The next move was not toward the gate. It was toward the Byzantine command. This was the confrontation the civilian faction had avoided from the beginning. Now avoidance was no longer possible. Several leading residents requested an audience. Theodoros went with them. They entered a building being used by senior officers. The room was guarded. Maps were spread across a table. Weapons stood near the walls. The commander listened without expression as the spokesman explained that the city needed to consider terms. He did not ask what terms. He asked who had authorized contact. No one answered. That told him enough. His expression hardened. "You have spoken to them." Theodoros stepped forward. "Yes." The room changed immediately. Two guards moved closer. One officer reached for the hilt of his sword. Theodoros did not move. The commander stared at him. "What you have done is treason." There was no surprise in the accusation. Under imperial military logic, it was correct. Theodoros had crossed the lines without permission. He had spoken with an enemy force. He had discussed surrender. But the civilians had reached the point where legality and survival no longer pointed in the same direction. Theodoros answered with the question the command had spent days avoiding. "Where is the relief army?" The commander did not respond. One of the officers said that assistance was being organized. Theodoros looked at him. "When?" No answer. The merchant beside him stepped forward. "Our food is being taken. Our men are being used. The sortie failed. The roads are closed. You tell us to wait. For what?" The officer ordered him to be silent. He was not. "For what?" The commander struck the table with his hand. That ended the argument for several seconds. Then the priest spoke. "If you cannot tell us when help will arrive, you are asking this city to be destroyed for a possibility." That was the accusation. Not that the garrison had defended Bosra. A garrison was expected to defend it. The accusation was that officers had continued demanding sacrifice while knowing the promise of relief was uncertain. Military history often calls this determination. Civilian history remembers the cost differently. The commander still possessed the authority to arrest them. He could have done it. For a moment, Theodoros expected exactly that. Then another officer entered the room. He spoke quietly to the commander. The words were not intended for civilians. They heard enough. Movement had been observed outside. Muslim forces were repositioning, possibly preparing for renewed pressure. The meeting could no longer remain theoretical. The commander asked how long the Muslim side had given them. Theodoros answered carefully. They did not give a time. That was worse. No deadline meant the besiegers were confident enough not to need one. The commander walked to the table. He looked down at the map. For the first time, the military position was being judged without speeches. The sortie had failed to break the encirclement. The relief force had not appeared. Civilians were organizing independently. At least one gate guard had already compromised his duty. The population was no longer politically reliable. The enemy outside did not need to breach the walls if Bosra tore itself open first. That was the reality. The commander finally asked what surrender would require. Theodoros told him, "End resistance. Accept the new authority. Pay tribute under agreed terms. Negotiate the withdrawal or status of the garrison before the situation collapsed into fighting." One officer objected immediately. Another did not. That was significant. The military faction was dividing too. The hardliners had spent days accusing civilians of weakness. Now some soldiers were reaching the same conclusion through battlefield arithmetic. A defense can remain possible after victory becomes impossible. That is the most dangerous stage of any siege. Commanders can still order men to fight. Walls can still hold. Weapons can still function. But every additional hour must be justified by an achievable objective. Bosra's officers could no longer identify one. The decision was not announced publicly. That would have created disorder. Instead, preparations changed quietly. Patrols were ordered to remain at their positions. Soldiers near the secondary gate were replaced with men trusted by the senior command. The civilians who had planned to force the entrance were told to stay away. Theodoros returned to the gate. This time there was no conspiracy. There was procedure. The locks were inspected, the bars were controlled. Messengers passed between the city and the Muslim representatives. Terms were confirmed. The tension was greater now because everyone understood what was happening. One mistake could still trigger violence. A nervous guard, a premature movement outside, a civilian shouting in the wrong place. A soldier deciding surrender was dishonor. History often compresses such moments into a sentence. The city capitulated. The gate opened. The army entered. That compression removes the danger. In reality, surrender is a military operation of its own. Weapons must remain controlled. Units must receive clear orders. Entrances must be secured. Civilians must be kept away from formations. The victorious force must avoid turning negotiated submission into an uncontrolled assault. The defeated force must decide whether it will obey its own commanders when ordered not to fight. Bosra now stood inside that narrow corridor. Theodoros remained beside the gate as the final bar was lifted. No one cheered. The Byzantine guards watched. The civilians behind them watched. Beyond the entrance, Muslim soldiers waited in formation. The gate moved, slowly, not broken, not burned, opened. The first Muslim troops advanced only after the signal was given. They did not rush. That mattered. A rush could have triggered panic. Instead, they entered in controlled ranks. Byzantine soldiers kept their weapons lowered. For several seconds, the two forces stood within sight of each other inside Bosra. The city was one command away from violence. The command never came. The soldiers passed. The garrison yielded its control. The walls remained intact. Theodoros watched Muslim troops moving into streets that Byzantine officers had sworn they would never enter. He had expected relief, then resistance, then perhaps destruction. Instead, he witnessed something more politically devastating. The empire lost Bosra while the city was still standing. There was no shattered wall to blame, no massive breach, no final heroic defense that could explain everything afterward. The defeat was harder to disguise. Byzantine authority had been subjected to a test. Its relief force had not arrived. Its offensive had failed. Its civilians had stopped trusting its promises. Its own officers had finally accepted the arithmetic. Bosra had not been destroyed. That was the success. Bosra had been lost. That was the judgment. And as Muslim soldiers took control of the approaches, Theodoros understood that the consequences would not stop at the black walls. Every city north of Bosra would hear some version of what had happened. Not simply that a Muslim army had taken another position, but that one of southern Syria's major cities had discovered the limits of Byzantine protection and chosen survival before destruction. The road into Syria had changed, and the empire had just given every city ahead a new question to ask. Morning did not bring destruction. That was the first fact Bosra had to absorb. The streets were still there. The market buildings were still standing. The churches had not vanished. Warehouses that had survived the siege remained locked behind the same wooden doors. Families emerged carefully, not because they understood the new order, but because they needed food, water, and information. Military control had changed faster than civilian life could adjust. That is often how conquest actually looks. Maps change in a day. People do not. The Muslim commanders now faced a different problem from the one they had faced outside the walls. A besieging army can concentrate on pressure. An occupying force has to govern what it has taken. Entrances had to be secured. Weapons had to be controlled. The status of Byzantine troops had to be settled. Tribute obligations had to be organized. The population had to understand which orders still applied and which authority had replaced them. This was the stage military chronicles often reduced to a formula. The city submitted. Terms were agreed. The army moved on. But those short phrases conceal the most important question after any surrender. What happens to the people who remain? Theodoros began looking for the answer immediately. He did not go first to the military quarter. He went to the market. That was where political change became measurable. Some shops remained closed, others opened only partially. Merchants stood near their doors without displaying their full stock. No one knew whether normal trade would resume. No one knew how tribute would be assessed. No one knew whether the old imperial obligations had ended cleanly or would be replaced by new demands. Those questions mattered more to civilians than the banners above the gates. Theodoros saw Elias, the merchant whose mules had been taken by the Byzantine garrison. One animal had survived. The other had not returned. No compensation had been given. There would probably never be compensation. The empire that had promised repayment no longer controlled the city. That was one of the quiet costs of Bosra's defense. Byzantine officials had requisitioned civilian resources in the name of military necessity. Then authority collapsed before the obligation could be honored. Later accounts would record the loss of Bosra. They would not record Elias's mule. Yet imperial defeat was built from thousands of losses exactly like his. Food removed, animals seized, labor redirected, trust consumed. An empire does not lose legitimacy only through battlefield defeat. It also loses it through unpaid debts to the people it ordered to sacrifice. Theodoros continued through the city. The change in behavior was immediate. Men who had demanded resistance only days earlier now spoke carefully about pragmatism. One official who had called negotiation cowardice claimed he had always believed Bosra should be preserved. Another insisted he had opposed the failed sortie. Theodoros knew that was false. He had heard the man argue for it. This was not unusual. Defeat produces memory faster than historians do. People rewrite their positions before anyone begins writing chronicles. Theodoros watched it happen in real time. The hardliners were becoming moderates. The cautious were becoming visionaries. The frightened were becoming men who claimed they had understood everything from the beginning. Political survival requires very little time to reorganize itself, but some men could not rewrite their roles so easily. Soldiers who had served the Byzantine garrison faced a harsher transition. Their authority had disappeared. Men who had been able to stop civilians in the street now had to wait for instructions from another military command. The reversal was visible. One former guard stood near the same intersection where he had previously questioned passers-by. No weapon in his hand, no authority in his voice. People walked past him. Theodoros recognized him. The man recognized Theodoros. Neither spoke. There was nothing useful left to say. The surrender also changed the relationship between Bosra's Christian population and the Muslim army now controlling the city. This was not a simple story of one religious community replacing another. Bosra sat inside a region where identities overlapped: Arab, Christian, imperial, local, tribal, commercial, military. The Byzantine state had relied heavily on Arab Christian populations and networks along its southern frontier. The Muslim forces arriving from Arabia entered a landscape they were not socially disconnected from. Languages overlapped. Tribal ties crossed imperial boundaries. Trade had already connected communities long before armies arrived. That did not remove the reality of conquest. It explains why conquest could sometimes advance through negotiation as well as battle. Bosra became evidence of that. The city did not have to be physically destroyed in order to leave Byzantine control. That lesson would travel north faster than any official explanation. Merchants carried it. Refugees carried it. Soldiers carried it. Messengers carried it. Every city ahead would hear that Bosra had fallen, but they would hear something more important. The walls had remained standing. That changed the strategic calculation. If resistance guaranteed imperial rescue, then resistance could be rational. Bosra had shown that rescue was not guaranteed. If surrender automatically meant uncontrolled destruction, then fighting to the end might still appear preferable. Bosra complicated that assumption too. Negotiated submission had preserved the city from the worst possible outcome. That was militarily useful to the Muslim command. An army advancing into Syria did not benefit from reducing every urban center to ruins. Destroyed cities consume time. They destroy supplies. They create refugees. They require more troops to control the aftermath. A city that submitted could provide revenue, markets, food, roads, information, and a base for further movement. This was not mercy separated from strategy. The two could operate together. That is one of the things military history often hides by dividing events into moral categories that did not exist so neatly on the ground. An army can restrain destruction because restraint serves expansion. A city can surrender because surrender serves survival. Neither fact requires romanticizing the conqueror or condemning every defender. It requires understanding the incentives. Bosra had changed sides because the balance of incentives had collapsed against Byzantine authority. The consequences were immediate. The Muslim advance now possessed a major position in southern Syria. Routes toward Damascus became more exposed. Byzantine commanders farther north had to reconsider the scale of the threat. What had previously been treated as pressure from Arabia could no longer be dismissed as frontier instability. A significant city had been taken. That meant the campaign had entered another stage. Theodoros understood this when he saw Muslim officers studying routes beyond Bosra. Not the streets, the roads north. Bosra was already becoming a platform for the next movement. That realization unsettled him more than the surrender itself. The city had survived, but survival did not mean the war had ended. It meant the war had moved. For Bosra, the siege was becoming memory. For Damascus and the other Byzantine positions ahead, it was becoming warning. Theodoros returned to his warehouse that evening. Stephanos was there, alive, exhausted, no longer serving the transport system that had pulled him into military work. They checked the remaining stores. Some goods had been lost, some had been requisitioned, some remained untouched. The warehouse had survived better than Theodoros had expected. That should have felt like victory. It did not. Too much had changed. A week earlier, he had lived inside Byzantine Syria. Now the same building stood under another authority. Nothing about the stone had changed. Everything about the political world around it had. That is why Bosra matters. Not because it produced the largest battle of the conquest, not because its walls were destroyed, they were not. Bosra matters because it exposed a deeper weakness. Byzantine power in southern Syria depended on more than soldiers. It depended on confidence. The confidence that imperial orders would be backed by imperial force. The confidence that civilians who sacrificed for the defense would not be abandoned. The confidence that local elites would continue to believe Constantinople offered the safest future. At Bosra, those assumptions began to fail at the same time. Later, imperial narratives could describe the loss as betrayal. That was easier than examining why civilians had reached the point of negotiating behind the garrison's back. Later conquest narratives could make the fall appear inevitable. That was easier than admitting how dangerous and uncertain the process had been. Both versions simplify the people trapped between them. Theodoros knew better. Bosra was not delivered by one heroic act. It was not lost through one cowardly decision. It was dismantled politically through accumulation, a relief army that did not arrive, a sortie that did not achieve its purpose, resources taken from civilians, confidence lost, factions formed, secret contact established, a gate prepared, a command forced to recognize that continued resistance no longer served an achievable objective. That was how the black-walled city changed hands, not with a wall collapsing, with an argument collapsing. Before leaving the roof of his warehouse, Theodoros looked toward the road north. Muslim patrols were already using it. The direction was obvious. Bosra had been the test. Syria was the campaign. And somewhere ahead, Byzantine commanders were still telling other cities that the empire would come. The people inside those cities would now have another example to consider. Bosra had waited. Bosra had resisted. Bosra had asked for help. And when help did not come, Bosra chose to survive. If this story reached you from a city that has lived through conquest, occupation, resistance, or the collapse of an empire, comment your city and country below. And tell us your theory. Was Bosra really lost on the battlefield? Or did Byzantine control collapse the moment the people inside stopped believing the empire could protect them? Subscribe for more forgotten military history, where the official version is only the beginning of what actually happened.